On patreon.com/consensusunreality you will find bonus episodes, written content and much more. This recording contains an exclusive follow-up and bonus episode only on Patreon. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another edition of Consensus Unreality, which is a podcast thing. What a great advert. We're joined here today by M, Elizabeth Scott, and Yasmina Hashemi to talk about their ongoing project, GOHAR GRAIL.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks you guys
for having us.
So do you want to just maybe describe a little bit of what is this project that you guys are working on and how you sort of came to, discover this connection you're making here?
I guess we around Halloween of 2020, I'm like, what is time anymore? We both kind of started like having these weird dreams. I had this dream about like this kind of maybe like a mass exile or like essentially like a cultural cleansing. And it was really weird because I wasn't myself in the dream. I was someone else and the time period was different, but there were all these kind of like references to Scotland, and there were also references to like ancient kind of Persia and Yasmina's family, and these sort of interior and exterior spaces were different. Like the exterior of this kind of apocalyptic landscape was really kind of this Scottish sort of wasteland, and the interior was this space where like Yasmina and the women in her family were kind of working through this this ritual. And I told her about it, and I guess around that time she was having kind of similar dreams. And we sort of, I don't know, I was like in October, November, I always get super haunted. Like I start kind of hearing the ghosts really intensely. And it's always like around the fall that I get this kind of like renewed interest in storytelling. And so I think I was watching some films. It was the trilogy by I'm blanking on his name right now, but the films were called My Ain Folk, My Childhood, My Way Home. Bill Douglas, he's a Scottish director, and they're kind of short. They're like an hour long. And I was just so struck by the way in which the figures were kind of represented and the way the story was being told. It really reminded me of like Iranian cinema. And we kind of just started talking about that. And I feel like from there, I don't even remember. What do you think, Yasmina?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, we were constantly sharing little bits from, I would watch an Iranian film or read a poem and send it to Elizabeth and kind of discuss what it meant. And she would do the same with, Scottish poetry or like a ballad that she would send to me, and we would discuss it. And then these synchronicities with the dreams kind of guided us to start having these conversations. And I think after, the film that really influenced you, Elizabeth, and I think there was a book from Scythia to Camelot that you shared with me.
And I don't even remember how I found it. It was so random.
Yeah, which is an incredible book. I think it's by Scott Littleton. And
Scott Littleton and Linda A. Melkor.
Yes. And I think that's when it kind of, that was for me what took off. Like the project started from that moment on, because the thesis in the book kind of connects the story of King Arthur and the knights of the Round Table, they connect them to the ancient Iranians. And they go through all these different symbolisms and how they all basically came from Iranian mythology, which is really fascinating. So that's kind of what guided us from the beginning.
Yeah, it's like a really crazy thesis, because I think when they wrote it, I'm forgetting the exact year it came out, but it was these two academics. They were basically like Arthurian researchers. Like, honestly, I have no idea how I found this book, because it's not known or famous. They were kind of like reading comparative literature of the Nart sagas from the Scythians, who are present day. They were sort of like Eastern Iranian nomads who then wandered over the steppe or the grass sea to Europe. And when, it's kind of interesting, because they're the only relic of these people, the Scythians, kind of in the, I guess, contemporary current of culture, is kind of settled in this landscape called Ossetia, that, the country Ossetia, between Georgia and Russia. And they've been subject to like a lot of violence from the sort of aggression between Georgia and Russia. But they're an Alanic people, and their language is kind of the only remnant of the specific Eastern Iranian, I guess, like linguistic structure. So it was like this really interesting thing that they kind of went to Ossetia, where there still is this intense pagan tradition that's been preserved, and pretty much, I'm sure it's been Christianized, but there are still pagans high up in the mountains there. And so the music that's sung there in the ballads there still contains these stories. And the stories that they compared the Arthurian legends to were the Nart sagas. And it's really interesting, because there's so many images that we see in this Arthurian kind of Christianized Celtic context, like the sword and the stone, or the Grail, or this sort of the cauldron. And these are all images that appear first in very similar array and similar narrative in the Nart sagas. And essentially, kind of the story is that the Scythians were brought to essentially to Scotland and like the Gallic world when the Romans were trying to conquer, when Hadrian's Wall was built. So they brought in all these kind of like sellsword guys. And I think a lot of them ended up staying. Some of them kind of continued to move on, but they left. The Scythians had this insane storytelling culture that just made this huge cultural impact on the British Isles, Scottish and Irish Isles as well. So there's this kind of relic of that as well. But then I think also, because neither of us are musicians, but we both listen to a lot of music, we kind of came across some Ossetian music at one point. And to me, it really felt like, okay, I've never had like an experience listening to music like this. It was like, it just felt so familiar that it made me want to cry. It was like, I've heard this before, like just so deep, kind of resonant. But also it really feels like the midpoint between maybe like Iranian music of some types and kind of Gaelic music or Scottish and Irish music. And all of these things, it's like the more that we would find, the more that we would kind of be led to all these really small and then larger kind of synchronicities. But with this project, we're kind of like tracing these narratives, and also not just to uncover this kind of like influence of the Scythians, which is very old, but we're kind of like interested in different cultural exchanges as well, some more contemporary, kind of any place where there's been an interplay, to sort of explore, why is it that these places have such a similar kind of essence to their storytelling cultures. Folklore, music, poetry, film.
Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like that was a rant.
No,
No,
not at all.
great.
It's amazing. It's such an exciting project, and I feel like excavations of cultural exchange are such a large part of the story of the occult and the sort of like Western esoteric tradition, and even the part of your project involving the Templars. There's that old story in passing about the influence of Sufism on the Templars, and that comprises so much and is spun in so many ways in conspiracy culture and stuff. So it's...
Yeah, I mean, Yasmina has done a lot of reading about kind of like Sufism and connections with like Saint George.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Which is really fascinating too. And like you said, it's been a part of like conspiracy, theories, and there's a lot of reading, materials on it. But I mean, even just the visual references, and just comparing them to like Saint George and then the representation in the Shahnameh and other Sufi texts of the same figure. It's been interesting.
And it's crazy too, because like, I think, these writers of that book From Scythia to Camelot, like this isn't the only book that explores this idea, but it is kind of the most famous. Like, I think like reading the introduction, it's like you get this vibe that like they were like, oh my God, this research is going to change Arthurian studies and like our understanding of the West and of England, and of our sort of like mythopoeic inheritance. Like they really felt like this was going to be this huge excavation. But it really didn't go anywhere. People read it, but there's a conservatism, I mean, not only like in this kind of branch of academia, but I think also like in the Western mind of sort of like, there's a desire, like King Arthur is kind of seen as this story, or this sort of like the greatest thing that maybe like the British Isles is sort of like given this story that has been made into hundreds of adaptations and is iconic, and it's so British. But so there was a lot of kind of pushback against any sort of acknowledgement of this. So they wrote this, and when you read different papers by academics who are kind of exploring, like Parsifal, or these kinds of other connections between Iran or then Persia and the UK. You'll see people make references to this, and to sort of make reference to their arguments, and to there's almost like this kind of like starstruck vibe that people like these weird academics will mention it briefly in this kind of like interesting way, but by and large I think this kind of maybe ruined their careers because people were like offended by it. And to me it's like, I don't think that every argument they make is foolproof or perfect or true, but they make a lot of arguments that have a truth in it that's undeniable. Like you see it and you're just like, like that's it, and you feel it too. Like I think that's the other thing. It's like, honestly, I think with this project, it's a creative one rather than like a research project per se. Like we're doing research, but it's not, as of now, like we're not really trying to make these like kind of impenetrable arguments. We're trying to connect to this resonance of myth and understanding that we have, and kind of go into that in a mythic way. So we're not trying to sort of like prove this hypothesis, but I think it's to be felt, and we feel it. And sort of as others have kind of like come to it, they're like, oh yeah, this is, yeah, you can feel the influence, like the relationship between Ossetian music and Irish music, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I thought it was, it's interesting that you can draw the the connection there all the way back to Roman times, because I guess the first thing that came to mind for me was like, yeah, like the Crusade era and like Templars and that sort of thing. So it's really interesting that this connection is like, you know, ancient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and just that you can still feel like ancient. I mean, you know, humanity is young and old at the same time. It's like all these stories like they've happened in the blink of an eye, and I think with the way that, you know, like, because I think I also come from this like Jungian perspective of maybe this like collective unconscious sort of feeling. Like, I do think on the one hand, sort of similar stories and symbols can pop up maybe simultaneously in different places. But I also think that when a story is really valuable, when a story is really true, symbolically true, you know, like that sort of mythic sense of, this is really dorky, but J.R.R. Tolkien had this word called eucatastrophe that he invented. I love this word. And it was sort of like about that moment in a myth when like you're just sort of on the verge of like total collapse, and then like at the last moment like goodness prevails and sort of like things are saved, and the emotional capacity that can release when you get to that point in the story. It's like I feel like this story of the Narts and Batraz kind of was so resonant to the Celts because it has that quality, like it's like a true myth, and so it's buried under all this overlay, but its origins remain.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we're approaching this as a creative project, but also we're both going through, especially last year and this year, we're, you know, doing ancestral work. And I mean, Elizabeth didn't even know, but my father's family is from that exact region in Georgia. And I mean, there's not that many records in Iran, so you can't really, you know, identify how far back they went and where, you know, what tribes they were in. But that's as far as like 2 generations ago, that's kind of the area that they were from. And then they moved to Tehran. So I do have that actual connection to the geographical, you know, the region that we're kind of focused on, which was really interesting. And yeah, the dreams have been kind of guiding us. And yeah, I'm excited by these loose threads that we're following. We're learning a lot as we do it, but also creating, you know, our own interpretations, which has been the most fun.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful that it's such a personal project as well. And I guess maybe we could talk about some of the ways that it's sort of manifesting through creative work. One of which was the mix of music you had made on, was it Montez Radio, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's just a really beautiful way to channel this. The separation in between like the types of music starts to dissolve very quickly and form into a singular sort of poetic sound, you know. And what are some of the other ways that you've kind of been taking these realizations and you know, manifesting them into creative work?
Yeah, I think we're I mean, we're kind of talking about sort of where we want to take it now, because we definitely want to kind of keep doing these mixes sort of as a series, because it's sort of like with music, I think music in this way that's different than other mediums, like has this capacity to sort of like open up the mythic dimension, or not even mythic, because music is almost like pre-story, even if it has lyrics. Like there's something more essential that is contained within it. And so in that sort of feeling of like, this is a truth to be felt, we were kind of approaching it from that direction. But I think we're also going to start working on a kind of like poetic work together, that's sort of about like this way in which stories travel. Like we've kind of talked about it, and it's funny because you I've been on your show before, so I've said before, like the dead talk to me, the spirits talk to me. I feel like the same is true of Yasmina. And recently, they told me that we're haunted dolls. Me and Yasmina are haunted dolls, and so they were like, you need to like make a book with like kind of like almost like this talismanic sort of place where we can kind of put these stories that are like haunting us in it a little bit and kind of like encase them in poems and images. So we're gonna kind of like, we're working on like a book around that theme, but I think we're gonna do something where we work with like a third translator and do this kind of game of telephone of sort of like translating translations and seeing sort of where the story ends up and where the symbols kind of change.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And really, really beautiful too. And I love the talismanic element. I think that's really interesting. I'm just trying to think about when these stories and stuff are channeled. Are they like imbued with some sort of like magic once they're encapsulated in something like that?
What do you think? Yes.
Certainly, they have to be.
Right.
Yeah. I think that is magic for sure.
Yeah, I feel like more and more like writing, I'm just really starting to understand, the way in which like a poem can be a spell, like, because sometimes, I don't know, like as a writer, like something will really be on my mind, and then if I put it into a poem, it's no longer torturing me in the same way often. Can be like in a page. And I used to think that was just like a function of release, but I actually have begun to feel like poems are vessels kind of.
For sure. Yeah.
Like almost like a spirit vessel of some kind, but.
Yeah. And the connection between language and magic, I feel like is pretty strong too. So I guess, yeah.
Especially in Farsi.
Well, even, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to spell a word, there's already like a relationship.
True. Oh yeah, that like speak and spell, like that depends on yeah, I always think, I mean, we've had so many conversations about this, Yasmina, where we're kind of like, just like seeing a connection between, like, so there's this word in Scots primarily, but it appears in the folkloric kind of witchcraft traditions of the British Isles in general. Besom, I don't know if you know what it is. It's like a bundle of sticks. It's like a broom. It's like the kind of witch broom sort of is taken from, this idea of the besom, like a twig bundle that was used for spirit flight. And this word like is really similar to this Zoroastrian word, barsum. Is that how it's said, Yasmina?
Yes.
Yeah, like which is a bundle of sticks that was used in a ritual context.
So many parallels like that.
Yeah. Crazy parallels. Or we'll be kind of reading, like I was reading this poet Hugh MacDiarmid, whose real name is like Michael Grieve, but I always heard his name. He's this Scottish poet, kind of was writing in, I guess like he started around in like the 20s. So he was, kind of like older school, but he was like extremely radical. And of course, like, had some questionable, maybe like political leanings, like kind of didn't fit in anywhere. Like he was a communist, but like the communists kicked him out because he was like a Scottish nationalist, and then the Scottish nationalists kicked him out because he was a communist, but he loved Stalin, which of course hasn't aged well as a view, but I think it was before a lot of the information about what he was doing was kind of happening over there. And he kind of like even wrote about this theory that he had, that there was this connection between Gallic culture with that of the country of Georgia, which was why he felt that he had this kind of like feeling about Stalin or some kind of commonality or something. Obviously that's kind of like a weird thread, but it's just to show this kind of like you know, there are these threads that pop up everywhere. Like you kind of look at even like the Declaration of Arbroath, like this Scottish kind of early sort of political declaration. They make this assertion that they're Scythian. The word Scoti being the kind of early word for the Scythians, or Skoloti. So there's all this kind of sense of what's underneath. But yeah, it's like this language. Language is like this huge thread.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess all these like sort of softer borders between cultures makes sense, since it was all sort of before the time of like the nation, more or less, right?
For sure.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, especially with Scotland, it was like more of a kind of collection of maybe like principalities at that time.
Yeah.
I think with the Declaration of Arbroath, it's like the time that Scotland became like a nation, I believe.
Yeah.
And that was, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Do you see like the spoken word as a integral part of this project too, the sort of like vocalization of language?
This is the first time we've talked like out loud about the project. Like, I mean, not Yasmina and I, but like publicly, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, the second mix, there was a lot of like storytelling involved in the mood of this mix. You know, it starts with Shamlu, who is a poet, and so I think a lot of the symbolism in the second mix was around, you know, this haunted doll vibe, and also like storytelling was a big part of it. And these like, the threads of the symbols made a lot of sense. Like it was chaotic, and then it ended up making so much sense as a whole. So that's
I feel like that sense of like, I guess something I always appreciate, just kind of being a poet and also being a reader. And maybe this is something that I got into through Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote that book, Borderlands, La Frontera. Like she writes this book in English and Spanish. And when I read it, you know, I couldn't read what she was writing in Spanish. I was just kind of like walled out. And I really liked that because she was sort of talking about borders. And I love the idea of like borders in general. Like my family, like on both sides is like, you know, like descended from the borders of Scotland and England. And I feel like that kind of one of the things that we were sort of thinking about with these mixes, and especially like with the second one, like it opens and closes with poetry. But, you know, that begins with Ahmad Shamlu, and it's sort of like he's there's no English translation like included in that you know, like auditorily or as text, you know, that we included. He's reading in Farsi. So me not being able or not being a speaker, I was walled out by that. You know, I read a translation of it, but I kind of like that because it's also, you know, like at the end we included this poem by Sorley MacLean, and there's a recording of him reading in Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, which is very political to him because it's a language that's being lost, and it has this whole history of kind of colonialism attached to that loss. But he's not just, you know, Sorley MacLean, not just interested in like the loss of his language. He sort of is interested in the loss of any language and sort of what this means. And then there's an English translation of part of it at the end. But I feel like to hear both of these poets read in their own language, to me, I just think with Gaelic poetry and with Farsi, it's like there's, you know, obviously like I can't understand either. So listening to the sounds, I can hear this similar kind of approach to rhythm, to sound in poetry that is really specific, and I don't hear when I'm maybe say listening to you know, like other languages maybe that I'm not a speaker of. But I think like that idea of like maybe like being let in a little, maybe being walled out, and also maybe being like it's important to sort of preserve the magic of like original language. Like in translation, something is always lost, but because there's so much sort of loss and exile that has happened both kind of in Scotland and in Iran, to sort of like include or think about like spoken word and spoken language seems important.
Yeah, and this idea of like the haunted doll is captivating me in the moment too, because it kind of like gets you thinking about how the iconography of myths are sort of like haunted dolls, and they're these compound structures that once you start to interrogate the makeup of this myth, of something like the idea of like Baphomet, and you have like the famous drawing by Eliphas Levi, but if you start to sort of like interrogate the history of that iconography of mythology, there's like a whole like cultural exchange that can be excavated there. Have you encountered the Baphomet mythology in your research at all?
No, but I mean, maybe Yasmina has. I personally haven't.
Not directly, no, but
it's like
I can.
Yeah, I only ask because it's like it's a large part of like the Templar story.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like
it's crazy too because the sort of goat-headed god. I mean, that is a figure who appears so much in Scottish kind of folkloric witchcraft. The witch's devil, Cornish as well is called like the Old One, France. So there's this kind of thread running through there of this sort of like man goat vibe and this connection with the witchcraft. Also, it's kind of a crazy, I mean, I love this word religionistic. It's like something that Jung gets kind of accused of a lot, where there's this sort of like equating of different myths. So I'm not trying to do that for sure. But the sense, I think I saw or read that the oldest ever image depiction of a god was of a horned god in the cave of the Three Brothers in France. It's a really silly image. It's so funny looking. It's like comedic and also amazing and beautiful. But certainly it seems like that god has been god or gods, like that sort of archetype has been moving around place to place for a while.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, something that came to mind for me when you guys were talking about the project was, I feel like there's all this border stuff. So I guess like obviously Hermes and Mercury and all of the various analogs of that figure feels like it might have something to do with the project. I don't know.
I would say we're both pretty mercurial people.
It's been confirmed.
Yeah.
Confirmed.
Yeah, this is kind of left field, but I wonder if because I know in Celtic lore there's a lot to do with like the severed head. Have you found anything about that in the sort of connections you're making? It's been a personal mythological interest of mine for the last few weeks. I'm just wondering if anything like that came up.
Interesting.
Nothing's come up directly, but I mean, it's a big part of a lot of Shahnameh tales, which is not really directly to this research, but I'm obsessed with the Shahnameh, and it's depicted in those stories a few times. I just would have to kind of pull it out. I haven't paid direct attention to it, but that's interesting that you brought it up.
What are some of like the mythological connections that have made themselves more prominent within this story?
Do you mean the Arthurian or?
Yeah, or sort of any of it, you know. I'm just curious. I just think that's really interesting. Sort of unpacking different mythologies and, you know, the similarities between.
I think women as warriors has been one that's jumped out with respect to like, because we're so, you know, fascinated initially by this Arthurian kind of this thesis and the Scythians. So I think, yeah, women as warriors is one that's keeps coming up. And then like the serpent imagery and the themes around that. And then once again, associated to Lady of the Lake, who's also known as the White Serpent and other myths. So the connection between women and snakes for me has been really interesting.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, like, yeah, we're saying like the image of the sword and the stone is like the most kind of iconic part of that. And it appears first in the Nart saga with Batraz, and the Scythian. I mean, the whole way that you see the depiction of the Knights of the Round Table, their armor, their swords, all of their dress, and their horseback, even like riding. These are all things that were, you know, like horseback kind of battle, I guess, for like military, like horses were not really a thing until I forget exactly when folks started doing that, but I remember that it was in Iran. People were not fighting on horseback prior to. And so like when you see even just, you know, the clothing and the whole way in which they're styled, it is pretty much like tit for tat this Scythian dress. Also, yeah, like the Scythians would always basically not pull a sword out of the stone, but actually put it in. And that is sort of a reversal of one of the images that occurs. But outside of the Arthurian thing, you know, kind of like reading these poems, reading these, or listening to folk music from any of these places, I think one of the things that I really feel comes up again and again is this really intense sense of loss, and this sort of, it's like a really particular flavor of loss that I just feel like is kind of like comes up in the ballads and comes up in some of the folk music that Yasmina shared with me.
Yeah, it's a big theme. Loss and displacement. I mean, for me, even now, I'm technically in exile. I mean, not dramatically. I mean, I can go back, but, you know, it feels like that, to be completely separated from the place you love and your family, not being able to be with them every day. And that's like a recurring theme, I think, in this lifetime for me, in all my lifetimes. And it's like, you know, and all of the ancestral work and the, you know, the dreams, it's always, you know, a tribe that is like on fire, and I'm like kind of like watching it all burn down. And it's a recurring thing for me, this kind of displacement. So it really, yeah, this project is a huge part of that. That's why I think both of our different interpretations of it really resonates together. I don't know why, but it works.
Yeah, that's incredible. I feel like it's a really important project too. Kind of what we mentioned in the beginning about like how much this sort of like excavation of cultural exchange, I feel like is a large part of the history of conspiracy culture, and it's kind of like a battleground for people's pattern recognition, where you get the whole like ancient aliens effect and stuff like that. So to sort of like, you know, genuinely tell this story, but also channeling it into, you know, these poetic sort of you know, works and stuff, I think is really cool and important. Sorry,
well, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, like, no, yeah, thank you.
Just not a question.
Yeah, there's like this sense of yeah, no, it's okay. We're flattered. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of like one of the things that I don't know, like am totally just recently really obsessed with that poet Sorley MacLean's work. He's from the island, one of the islands, from a place called Raze. And he basically kind of grew up after the Highland clearances. And he was like a leftist, like hardcore. Most of the Scottish like national poets and writers are like hardcore leftists, which is really interesting considering like, this was pre like, I mean, it was before like leftism was maybe quite so popular as it is now. So um like there's a sense of the way in which kind of the people in the Highlands and Islands were kicked off their land and beaten and terribly punished for use of their own language, to the point where Gaelic is so in decline now that it's not even really, like in Ireland, they've been able to salvage some of the remnants of the Irish language, which is really similar to Scottish Gaelic, because they were able to sort of, I guess, disengage or get away from, I mean, not obviously like not all of Ireland, but, they were able to become their own nation and kind of cut off their colonizer being England. But with Scotland, it's like there's this terrible loss of culture and language and this terrible sense of exile. The lands were given to either like Englishmen or like wealthy like lowlanders. And I don't know, I was watching this documentary short. It's called Sorley MacLean's Island. It's online for free. It's really beautiful. But he kind of just talks about this sort of loss and exile, and how like these grand mismanagements of a country, of a government, essentially, like he says something like, I mean, he says he indicts a lot of things, a lot of factors into how this has happened, this loss of language, this exploitation, impoverishment. But he says like our children are bred for immigration. And like, one of the things that I think, I don't know, there's so much that I think is like compelling to me about this collaboration with Yasmina, because I think this is like I mean, like this is the story of immigration, like an exile. Like it's different for every kind of group of immigrants, but there is this sort of thread of like why people leave the place they're from, or why people have to or forced to leave the place that they're from, the place of that those all the stories in their heart are from, and Yasmina said something to me recently as well about because she had just seen Chess of the Wind, and she said like yeah, all of our stories are unfinished. And I feel like that's something that is a really like, I mean, these are specific things, and I don't want to equate things too much. Like not all stories are the same, but I think that there's commonality in so many, this is like a global story as well. Like the story of loss, exile, kind of having to leave a place because it's been so, it's become such an impressive environment for various factors. And I don't know, this sort of like feeling of the unfinished narrative is like very, yeah, sort of like what is haunting, I guess. And then on the other hand, I think there's like a beautiful sense of like, I mean, even just to imagine this, like to think, wow, what if the West is so influenced by Iran that like all of the stories that are deep in our unconscious resonate? Like that's kind of a radical thought when you think about like US or like English or just kind of like Western relations with Iran and with the wider part of the world. It's pretty radical in a way. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No, I just agree with you. And I think it's interesting that we came to this through magic and through our dreams. And it's kind of very comforting. Once you acknowledge this interconnectedness, you don't really feel like you're in exile as much, you know? And, you know, there's still a pain and you're still kind of working through it. And I mean, all the poets that I'm, you know, currently reading and that I share with you are all 60s leftist Iranian poets too, which is really interesting. And like a bunch of them were killed by the regime, the Shah's regime. But yeah, so there's some, yeah, it's very haunted for sure, but comforting. It's nice.
It's haunted, yeah.
It's not bad. It's good haunted.
Are you sort of keeping an archive of this work and the exchange that you two personally have?
Good question.
God, maybe we should.
I really want to do more of a visual. I've been drawn to like visually explore these themes that we're talking about, as you know, because we have some writings and we are working on the translation book project, but I really want to do more of a visual collaboration as well. And I want to start recording some of our conversations and some of these kind of negotiations and the ways in which our thoughts are flowing, because they end up making a lot of sense and I want to capture it, but we haven't yet really.
I think we also really want to like start interviewing people, like, but just super like, I feel like Yasmina had this idea of, I had been taking like bagpipe lessons with this crew of like, oh my God, Dave, you would think it was so funny. They're like these Jersey dudes. They literally meet in, like the setting of the Italian American Club in The Sopranos is actually the Scots American Club in Kearney, New Jersey, which is where they, and they're all like, hey, Lassie, what's up? Like, but it's so funny. They're like, and there's some Italian like Newark dudes in the band really weirdly. It's like mostly like these like Scottish descent, like Jersey guys. But we just kind of like, I was like, damn, like, yeah, I feel like Yasmina had this idea of doing some kind of interview with them. And like, I just feel like we could take it in so many places. Cause I think also like the idea of diaspora and how like crazy that can be is really compelling. Like even, you know, Dave, you're in Philly, like Kensington is like this crazy, like Irish, like American hub, but it's like also one of the most cursed and sad places of all time. And it's interesting because that connects to this as well, you know, like the story of Ireland, famine, mass immigration for these sort of emergency reasons. I don't know, like love to kind of like either do some field recording or interviews or something.
Do you guys have any plans for sort of the next steps of this project?
Yeah, I think we're just going to be working on this book and kind of putting together some more of the mixes in this series. But I'm going to be going to Scotland in January and doing some research in some ballad libraries there. And hopefully kind of like trying to connect some dots with that. Because I feel like that's kind of something, you know, and I think Yasmina, you're hoping to go to Iran soon-ish.
Yeah, I hope in the new year for sure.
Yeah. So we're going to be kind of doing some independent research like on site, hopefully.
That's amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great that, the collaboration will go back to sort of the nodes from which it started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also like long-term dream, like, wow, how crazy would it be to go to Ossetia, to North Ossetia? That's like, I'm obsessed with that idea. And just kind of like, because it's,
you have to get a permission, or like you would have to get a visa or permission to actually go.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's trying. He's currently on right now, and it's something he's always wanted to do. But it's a huge process apparently, but it's possible.
Yeah. It's like even just Georgia, like, because there's that kind of interesting, similar polyphonic music thing there. But it seems like there are so many I don't know, it's also like the deeper that we get into this, the more that these sort of chance or rare kind of like ethnographic recordings from like ballad collectors become so important. You know, like there's this song that Flora McNeil, who is like a Gaelic singer, sings Alan Dwyn, and it's like dark-haired Alan. And when you think of like Alania, the Alans, the Iranians, it's like really interesting to think about that. But yeah, it's almost like these sort of, sometimes it seems like these musical records are like some of the few kind of ways in which these stories remain. And like, so Far Off Dreams, maybe like traveling and recording some music in different places would be really cool.
Wow, that would be really exciting. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I think that was a really great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on. I think that, yeah, it's really cool to see like a collaboration like this, like in progress. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, it's cool because it's just like the beginnings kind of too of this ongoing project. So I think that's really exciting, and it's almost like you're kind of continuing to talk it out, you know, on our show today.
Yeah.
Which is really awesome.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, it was the first time we've ever articulated it to others, you know, in this way. So it's nice.
The potential is so exciting too.
Yeah, I feel like we're both super into like changing with the process, rather than kind of like setting a course. So things may change at will.
Amazing. So, is there any sort of, like, what would the terminal be for people to experience this project at this point?
Yeah. Well, I can send you some links to like the archived like shows so far. And we're going to keep kind of doing that series, and kind of like branch out more in the next few months.
And we share little bits of our research as we do them on our Instagram page. We don't have a website or anything yet, so that's kind of where we congregate and meet and discuss with other people and share what we found. Yeah.
Care to drop the handle?
Yeah, I guess I will.
Yeah, it's at GOHAR X GRAIL.
Yes.
Yeah, check it out, and check out the mix too. The mix is really incredible. I was listening to it, you know, earlier today for just driving around Philadelphia. So
amazing.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you guys again for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and we hope to you know, follow the project and see what comes next.
Thank you. Have a lovely night.
Thank you.
You too. Talk soon.
Bye. Happy holidays.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.